So don't worry, you're not crazy. I'm really using the opening of Star Wars with the theme of 2000: A Space Odyssey, because that last one is royalty free, and I don't want to have any trouble with John Williams. Welcome. So I know that you're coming from very far, far from outer space, and you came here to find a solution to the problem you're facing. Let me sum up what the problem is. Usually in a software architecture, we put our business logic inside our backends. We think that this is a best practice because we don't want that business logic to be duplicated on all the possible consumers we may have, like a desktop application, responsive application, mobile application, and so on. Here, I have represented a real booking system. So I have some features like performing a search for trains going to my destination or selecting a train with a fare. And since we don't put the user in front of our backends because he doesn't know how to speak JSON, we also develop frontends. And he can use the features through that frontends. And the thing is, we are all using the richness of the English natural language to express all the subtlety of the business domain. That's why we have functions like perform search for train going to my destination. But the front end and the back end are on each side of the network, and in between we are using REST. And REST only has 4 words of vocabulary, which are create, read, update, delete. So it means that when the front end wants to invoke, perform a search for trains, it has to map it to create a search resource. And then on the backend side, we will translate it back to create perform a search for trains going to the destination of the user. Another example, selecting train with a fare. This one, we will map it on an update of a sub-resource selection inside the search. And this is purely arbitrary because we could have created a new resource, which is a selection resource. And here we can ask ourselves what we are doing that, because we have the English natural language for the features, but we have to translate everything to make sure that this kindergartner child in between can understand what's going on, because he knows only 4 verbs. And the thing is also that the user wants to search for train going to his destination. He never asks you to create a search resource. We are doing that because this is the paradigm of REST, using CRUD on resources. And even though the sentences are equivalent regarding REST, I think that you quite agree that they don't have exactly the same sense. In the second sentence, we have a loss of notion regarding the train, the destination, and so on. And I'm pretty sure that when you have to develop user stories, you rather like those user stories to look like I want to search trains for going to my destination than create a search resource. And if unfortunately your user story is create a search resource, I'm strongly advising you to fire your product owner. So here we can clearly see that because we want to translate everything in those 4 words of vocabulary, we have what we call an impedance mismatch. And it comes from the uniform interface of REST. So what is it? You have to know that before 2000, if you wanted to interact with the backend, the only thing you had was the HTTP protocol. But the way to use HTTP was a bit specific to the backend. And it was a real nightmare. So REST came in 2000 and said, okay, now we will standardize a bit the things, and we will say that on each backend we will have resources. And we will use the HTTP verbs mapped on the CRUD to handle those resources. That's the uniform interface. But the thing is that in 2000, Roy Fielding, who has formalized REST in his thesis, warned us about something with the uniform interface. He said that since the information is transferred in a standardized form, we will degrade the efficiency of the system because the information is not shaped in a way to fit the application needs. And here he explained in a way that impedance mismatch, that loss of meaning we have inside our APIs. So it also means that, so that's a picture took from Interstellar, but if you represent the black hole in the back like the uniform interface of REST that CRUD on resources, and that astronaut has the business intent in your APIs, it just engulfed by the black hole and doesn't exist anymore, and you just have a technical REST API. So I didn't introduce myself. My name is Julien Topçu. I'm a technical coach at Shodo. And in fact, I'm the one coming from very far from the outer, the English channel, as you can notice with my accent. So it means that I'm French. And Shodo is a French consultancy company. At Shodo, we invented a startup, which is named Colombian Express. We help people to travel between the Earth and the Moon, because we didn't know what to invent to get French public funds for innovation, which are tax-free, by the way. But that startup does not exist. It was just a joke. But I have developed a little domain for space travel that we will explore today, on which I've applied an ancient technique, which is 20 years old, that will help you to bring back business intent into your REST API. So I will do a little demonstration of the software. As you can see, it really looks like a real booking system. Here I have a search form. I can say that if I want to do a one-way or a round trip, I have to select a spaceport. Here I will select the JFK Space Center, and I would like to go to the moon in Mare Cognitum. If I hit search, I will have all the outbound space trains. And for each of them, I have a fare that I can select. I will select the first class. By doing that, the selected train now appears on the panel on the right, which is the selection. You can see that for now, the book button is disabled because I want to do a round trip, but I have selected only the outbound. That's pretty normal. By selecting the outbound, the UI has changed to display me only the compatible inbound trains. So I can select one of them with a fare. And now my selection is complete, so the book button is enabled, and I can book my trip. And you can see that with Colombian Express, you can do round-trip travel to the moon for only 600 euros. Let's say that we won't last long, and we will never become a unicorn. So that's the domain we will explore today, on which I have applied that technique. And the technique that will help you to bring back business intent in your API has also a really good side effect, which is purely technical. I will do a little demonstration now, and I'm pretty sure this is the best demonstration you will ever see with REST. And now I have some pressure. Okay, so let's go back to the page where we have our space train. Okay, so let's see what is happening on the network. Okay, I will refresh the page so I can find my request. Is that big enough? You can read the URL or not? Yes? Okay, so how that URL is built. It started with searches because that's the main object of my API. I append an ID to retrieve a particular search. And inside that search, I have a list of space trains that can be inbound or outbound trains. So the front end, since he wants to only display the outbound ones, he have to specify a request parameter named bound and say he wants only the outbound. Okay. So for the rest of the demonstration, I will switch to Postman because it will be more readable. So first thing I'm doing, I'm performing a search, and after that, I'm retrieving the outbound trains. Okay, so this is exactly the same request. Okay, so here I have the trains, and you can see outbound here in the URL. Let's imagine now that my product owner say to me that we are opening the Mars market, and by doing that, we will like to offer to our users to do multi-destination travel. It means that they can go from the Earth to the Moon, then to Mars, and going back to Earth. And with multi-destination, outbound and inbound doesn't mean anything. We rather like to talk about the first journey, the second one, and so on, until the last one. So I've been asked to change my backend and also asked to change the API as well. So let's go to the backend. So the backend is developed with Spring Boot and in Kotlin, but that's not really important for the rest of the talk. But here I have the controller that will help the front end to retrieve the space trains. You can see here the request parameter, bound, which is an enumeration that can be outbound or inbound. I will change that. Instead of using that, I will say that I need a journey index that will be an integer. And since I don't want to develop the whole multi-destination feature for now, I will convert it back to a bound. So it means that when journey index is 0, it will be converted to outbound, and when journey index is 1, it will be converted to inbound. Okay, so let's restart the application now. Okay, it's compiling. What is the impact of my modification? What is the impact? What? Sorry? Yes, but what is the impact for the consumer? Yes, but it means that I have broken the API, right? So if I'm going now on Postman, I'm trying to retrieve the outbound trains without changing any piece of code, I will have a bad request because the backend expects a journey index. So what we just have demonstrated is that if you change your URL or your request parameter, you will break your API. But I'm pretty sure you know that already, right? Yes? So that's a great demonstration. But the big part of the demonstration is not there, in fact. My front end is developed with React and JavaScript, and you agree that I never changed any piece of code from the front end, right? I never restarted that front end, which is running in a node process. So let's see what's happening now on the front end, which is still up and running. Okay, I will try to retrieve the outbound train. Do you think it will work or not? No? It works. So what is going on the network? So let's refresh that page, and you will see that without having to change any piece of code, the front end detected the change and made that change for me. And that's a great demonstration, right? No? So you want to know how it works? Yeah. Okay. So like I said, it comes from that techniques that will also help you to bring business intent into your APIs. That's a good side effect of that technique. So let's see how to craft business-oriented web APIs. For me, in fact, we already have everything in REST to do that thing. But there is 4 problems that are preventing us for crafting business-oriented APIs. The first one is that we have false beliefs regarding REST. Let me explain that. Let's take that feature, booking from a selection. That feature will create a resource booking from the selection of the user. If you want to map that in REST, which kind of HTTP method you will use and which base URL you will use as well? Any proposition? Proposal, sorry? Which HTTP method? Sorry? Post, because I'm creating a new resource. And usually people are using bookings as a base URL. If you are doing another way, that's not really important. But since I'm creating a resource, I have to use a post in that case. This is the uniform interface of REST. But let's take another example. The rebooking. So it means that you already have a booking, you want to rebook the same train at another date. By doing that, you create a new booking resource from an existing one. You don't update the existing one, you create a new one. Which kind of HTTP method and URL you will use? Put is to update. Sorry? Post as well. And usually, because this is, I will create the same resource, I will also use post booking. And here maybe you can see the smell. Because we have two different use cases on the same endpoint. And it comes from the fact that there is that impedance mismatch, because all the sense of selection in the first case is lost. The selection is a sub-resource of the search, which is unique. So it means that there is no ID to identify the selection itself. You have to retrieve that from the parent object, which is the search. So that's why in the first use case, you only need the search ID. In the second one, there is a semantic confusion because you have to create also a booking, but in that case, this is a rebooking. In the first case, this is a booking from a selection. The only way to do, let's say, the difference is through the payload. And it also means that we have to support polymorphic payloads, which is quite hard to do. So what people are doing to fix that problem, in the second use case, they will do post-rebookings, for example. That can work, but not in my case because rebooking is an action and not an entity. It means that for the business people, you have two ways to create a booking, from a selection or an existing booking. But once created, this is exactly the same object. There is no difference, and it has exactly the same life cycle. If you say that you have two different kinds of resource, bookings and rebookings, it means that they are different. But that's not the case. And you have done that, why? Because of some limitation of REST. If you were using a message queue, you won't have that problem. And REST and the technology must not design your domain. Does some people there apply domain-driven design? Yes. Or clean architecture? Yes. So I'm pretty sure that you know that the technical part should not design your business logic, right? No? Yes? That's a bad practice. And furthermore, there is something which is really important. Rebooking sounds like functional, but that's not functional. That was invented by the developers. So it can confuse the business people. And they can wondering why we have rebookings now. Is that really different from a booking? And this, you will have entropy in your structure, and it brings a lot of accidental complexity. You have now to figure out why we have rebookings and booking. So it means that we cannot say that rebooking is, in that case, an entity or resource. How we will fix that problem? So for me, we have to align with the business workflow. What is doing the user? The user, if he wants to rebook an existing booking, he goes on that booking, and he specifies a new date and rebook. So let's do exactly the same thing. So let's go to the booking he wants, bookings with the ID, and I'm appending something that is called a classifier in REST /rebook. This is a verb. So I'm pretty sure that with that URL, you all know what is the intent of that API. That was not the case with post-booking only, right? I still have to comply with the uniform interface. It means that since I'm creating a new booking, the HTTP method to use will be a post. And then the booking will be created and will be retrieved like any other booking on the get booking endpoint. And we are complying with what we want the business. Two ways to create a booking, from a selection, from a rebooking. And once created, this is exactly the same thing. But maybe some people are not comfortable with that because they heard that we cannot use verb in REST. Who heard that? Yes, some of you. You have to know that this is a false debate. Let me explain you why. So does some people use that nomenclature where your base URL is the name of your resources at plural, and you append the ID and so on and so on? That's a help, and we don't really know from where it comes. This is just to help you to build URLs. But if you take a look at the thesis of Roy Fielding, at no time he will say to you how to build that URLs. You have constraints, but the way to construct URLs, you have no information about that. The only thing you can't do is to use verbs inside your URLs which are at odds with the HTTP method. Say, for example, get create, you should not do that. What is the expected behavior of get create on the backend? Because get should not create, but you have create in the URL. That's confusing. This is the only thing you can't do. And Roy Fielding is going further. It said that, and this is pretty weird, at no time the server or the client should know the meaning of the URLs. So they should not know how they are built. But I'm pretty sure that when we are all crafting a front end, when we want to discuss with a backend, we do such things. We say, okay, so the main object is searches. If I append an ID, I will retrieve a search. If I want the sub-resource selection, I'm concatenating /selection as well. So it means that the front end knows how to build the URLs, right? But he said that we should not do that. And if you are not doing that, this is one of the secrets of the magic trick at the beginning of the talk. Wow. So that's really weird. We say that the front end should not know how to craft the URL, but it needs to talk with the backend. How does it work? So I will show you how it works. But I still have to explain one more problem regarding the way we are constructing our URLs. The second problem is that we make a confusion between the model and the business. That might sound complicated, but you will see that's pretty easy to understand. The business is exactly what the user is doing. For example, that user, she wants to select a fare on a train. She's on the outbound space train page, and she clicks on the fare she wants. This is how she selects a train with a fare. But on the backend side, this is what we call the model, the modeling of the problem, how we will solve that. So on the backend, I have a search resource. Inside it, I have a list of space train that can be outbound or inbound space train. I also have a sub-resource selection, and in that sub-resource, we have a list of selected space train. I'm pushing the number of the space train in that list to say, okay, those are the ones who the user selected. But I could have done something else. I could have used Booleans on space train on the first list, and each time the user changes her selection, I'm synchronizing those Booleans. That also works. So it means that we have several ways to implement the problem, to implement the solution. This is what we call the modeling. And if you are doing domain-driven design, you know that a model won't last long. This is just to solve a specific problem at a certain period of time. And in fact, the problem is that this is implementation. And when you want to expose that as an API, you expose an implementation, the structure of your code. So it means that if you need to change that code later, you will break your API because it complies. This is a one-on-one mapping with the structure of your code. And that's a mistake. So usually what people are doing, if you want to select a train with a fare, you have to update. Patch is like put if you don't know it. This is to update. Not exactly the same thing, but doesn't really important for the talk. So I have to update the sub-resource selection in the search. And it may have a big impact on your consumer. For example, if your business domain is not trivial and you don't have any UX researcher, okay, so I think you quite understand that the user wants to select a fare on the train and you are exposing update selection, sub-resource, and so on, which is not the same thing. Okay, I forgot that slide, sorry. So to bring back to the use case where the domain is not trivial and you don't have UX researcher, I have saw that already, but that doesn't happen much, is that all the user experience is built like the API. So it may be really confusing for the user, because if you ask him to update a sub-resource selection in the search to book a travel, what the heck? But that doesn't happen much. Most of the time we have this, a beautiful front end and ugly back end. Because the front end still has to comply with the business intent. He has to display the trains, display a way to select a train with a fare. But once he has done that and the user has selected what he wants, he has to translate that into update a sub-resource selection that patch stuff. The ugly APIs we have on the backend, it also means that all the consumers they have to do that translation as well. If you have desktop application and so on and so on, they all have to do that. This is because we are exposing our modeling, our implementation to our consumer instead of the business intent. And this is what I'm calling the accidental complexity of adaptation, of translation. And what we should do, we should encapsulate that in the backend and make sure that the backend exposes a business-oriented API, which is not really aligned with the implementation, but with what the user wants. But the thing is, this is quite easy to say, because there is a problem with REST. There is a problem with encapsulation. You all know what encapsulation means? Yes? Yes? So basically, if I take that class, I have a search class. In that class, I have attributes, and I only have getter setters. This is what Martin Fowler called an anemic domain, because there is no behavior attached to that class. There is no encapsulation there. It means that each piece of code which is using the search will have to implement the business logic of the search and do defensive code to make sure that the search is in a consistent state and verify all the invariant of that search. We consider that as a bad practice. If you are doing object-oriented programming, usually you encapsulate the states and expose behaviors as function. It means that you no longer expose any setters, but you have function that will make sure that all the state transitions are made in a consistent way. For example, you have done a search from London to Leeds. It means that your criteria says your departure is London, your arrival is Leeds. If you hit the search button, it means also that you have trains coming from London going to Leeds. Let's imagine now that the user wants to change. He wants to go to Manchester. And you have done a set criteria saying, okay, he wants to go to Manchester. If you only do that, you will have a search with criteria saying that he wants to go to Manchester, but you still have trains going to Leeds, right? So it means that your search is in an inconsistent state. And instead of that, you should expose a behavior, which is change criteria, which will also reset the space train if the user wants to change his arrival or his departure. That's the concept of encapsulation. There's some people there develop that way. Only some of you, okay. But the thing is, if you are pushing efforts on that, you will be frustrated, because when you want to expose that on the network, you will de-encapsulate everything and expose states. Because the only thing you can do with REST is to serialize each attribute, but for the behaviors, how can we do that? And we can ask ourselves, are we mad again? Because in the backend, usually you have a controller and a database. And each of those are organized through a CRUD paradigm. And we are trying to put something in between, which is not really CRUD, but which is business-oriented, right? And it means that maybe the life will be simpler if the domain itself is just CRUD. So everything is CRUD. And if you are doing such things, why not using Postgres and the PostgreSQL plugin that will automatically expose all your tables as a REST API. And no code will kill us all. I mean, we can't do that because we have to implement complex business logic. So it means that we have to put business logic in the backend. And it also means that all the business logic must be inside the REST API also. And this is something that we are not doing. So for people doing domain-driven design, for me, the real meaning of CRUD is completely ridiculous and useless domain-driven design. Why are you doing that? Everything is CRUD in a developer's life. Another example of the encapsulation was when I had twice post bookings for different use cases. The only way to discover in which case we are is to take a look at the payloads to deduce the sense of the request. This is also an example of the encapsulation with REST. So to sum up, the user wants to select a train with a fare. This is what she's doing in the front end. The backend exposes usually an API like that. Update the sub-resource selection inside the search with a patch. And here, I'm using JSON patch. Who knows JSON patch? No one here? Okay, some people. So patch is like put, but with patch you can change each field in an atomic way. That's not the case with put. With put, you have to pass the whole resource or a sub-resource, right? With patch, you can say, okay, I'm just changing that field. And with JSON patch, you can specify which kind of operation you want to do on that field. Here, I'm saying that I want to add something in the field selected space train with a train number and a fare. So it means I want to select a train with a fare. And here we have two problems. The first one, I said that already, accidental complexity of adaptation. The front end has to translate the business intent into that ugly REST API. The second part is that you all had to read the content of the payload to understand what's going on. Because I could have put another payload that will help the front end to select a seat near the aisle or near the window. The only way we have to discover that is to read the payload. So once again, the encapsulation. Now I will show you how to fix all those. Quite easy. We will do exactly what the user is doing. So he's inside his search ID. Then he wants to select a space train. So let's take that space train with the number. He wants to select a code, a fare code, so fares and the code of the fare. And I'm appending a classifier, which is select. And now I'm pretty sure that with one line, you all know what is the intent of that request. And I no longer have any payload, by the way. I still have to comply with the uniform interface. I'm creating a selection, so this is a post. And on the backend side, I didn't change anything, in fact. The modeling is still the same. So it means that the controller received that request, and he is responsible for that adaptation, for that translation into the modeling of the domain. It's no longer the case in the consumers. The consumers, they can just align with the business intent because now our API is business-oriented. Is that okay? But there's still one problem. I said that the front end must not know how to build the URLs. So I can do fancy URLs like that. It should not know how to build them. So how does it work? That's weird, right? So did you heard about, sorry, forgot one thing. So there is a mean, in fact, to help the front end to discover those URLs. And it exists already in REST. But the thing is, we are not using that. And we rather like to do anemic APIs in terms of workflow. What does it mean? Regarding the workflow, sorry. What does it mean? It means that each time we build an API, we expose steps of a workflow like this. Here you have all the endpoints that will help you to do a round-trip search and a booking as well. So first thing, I'm creating a search with criteria. Then I'm retrieving the outbound trains. I'm selecting one of them. Then I retrieve all the inbound trains. I'm selecting again one of them. And since my selection is complete, I can create a booking. But I have one question for you. How do we know that we must proceed in that order? How do we know that?
Each call returns the possibilities.
Ah, that's great, but usually people are not doing that. But in fact, you just spoiled the rest of the talk. But usually people are not doing that. They just serialize everything. And in fact, you don't know. I don't say Swagger. In Swagger, you don't document what are the next steps. That's not true. It can be really complicated. So it means that your backend only exposes steps of a workflow. It also means that nothing is preventing the front end from displaying the inbound trends for the outbound ones. Because technically, if he knows how to build the URLs, he knows that he can do that. He can also try to retrieve the inbound trains for a one-way trip. That doesn't mean anything, but he can do that. And if the front-end developer has done some mistake, we will have some errors in production. The last thing is another example is that, in fact, nothing prevents the front end from calling the booking creation endpoint, although the selection is not yet complete. And the reason of that is because our API are anemic regarding the workflow. And only the front end implement that workflow. That's true. The orchestration of all your endpoints is only on the front end. But that's business logic, right? So it means also that all the consumers, they have to duplicate that logic, the workflow. They all have to do that. I have another example of that. If I want to display the booking button, I have to implement the business logic of what does it mean to be able to book a trip. For example, here, if my search is a round trip, I will try to verify that the outbound is selected and the inbound is selected. But that's business logic. So it's still on the front end. So it also means that for multi-destination, I will have to change that business logic as well. That's still business logic. So now it means that that business logic and the workflow, they must be encapsulated inside the API on the backend. So to make sure that we will prevent the consumer from doing stuff he can't do. But how we can perform such things? How do you serialize an API on the backend? A workflow, sorry, on the backend. Did you heard about the Richardson maturity model? Yes, some of you. So this is a model which is categorizing REST APIs. Level 0, you're not REST. You're RPC, whatever, don't care. Level 1, you organize your API around resources. Level 2, you are using HTTP verbs to handle the life cycle of those resources. And usually people stop there. But there is another level that was formalized with REST 20 years ago, which are the hypermedia controls. And this is where we will find the answer of everything. So hypermedia control is something that we call also ATOS. I don't know if you heard about that already. This is a really strange name for hypermedia as the engine of the application state. And I really like engine of application state because it sounds like a behavioral engine. And what is it? This is a linking system that will allow you to expose the relationship between your domain objects, explore the domain, and encapsulate the business workflow in your API. So I will make a little demonstration of that because my API has been built with that. So going back to Postman there. So like I said, the only thing the front end needs to know is the entry point to our API. Is there searches? Okay. This is the only URL you must know. After that, he needs to give to the backend the user inputs, which are the criteria. So here, he wants to go from that departure spaceport to that arrival spaceport at that departure schedule. So now the request has been sent to the backend, and it responded with, okay, 201 created. So it has created a search. And usually, what do you have in the search? The criteria, the space train, the selection. And what are people doing? In most of the use cases, they serialize everything in the response. And that won't be the case in my case, because you can see that I have the criteria, but you can't see any space train, any selection there. Instead of that, you have a set of links. And each links have a special meaning, which is a business meaning. For example, here, you have a link for the selection. It means that if I want to retrieve the selection, I take that URL as it, I don't care how it has been built, and I request it using the uniform interface. So it means that if I want to get the selection, I'm doing a get, and now I'm inside the selection. As you can see, for now, I don't have any space train selected. There is a nomenclature that says that each time you have to serialize a link to be able to retrieve the current resource. This is the self link. You can clearly see that we are on the selection. Is that big enough? Yes? I have here a link to go back to the search. So if I want to go back to the search, I'm going to retrieve that URL as it, and now I'm back to the search. That's as simple as it. But you can do things that are more fancier, because, like I said, I have several trains. I have trains for inbound and outbound in the same list. So it means that the front end have to say, I want only the outbound trains. I want only display that. So in the first version, I have to specify a request parameter, right? So now, you just have to look for the all outbound link. That's all. And it will request as it the content of that link. It doesn't care about how it has been built. Because the backend serialized in a way the request inside the payload. And if you take a look at it, you have here the journey index equals 0. So it means that since the backend is serializing the request, I can change the request as much as I want, because the front end is not sticky to the implementation of the URL. He's sticky to the meaning of the link, which is in fact all outbound. And you can change the URL as much as you want after that. You see how it works? This is why my magic trick was working at the beginning, okay? So to go further, for example, here I have a list of possible outbound trains. For each of them, I have possible fares. And on the fare, I have a select link, which has been built, like I said during the talk, space train with the number, fares with the code of the fare, and the classifier select. So it means that if I'm hitting that endpoint, that time I'm using a pause because I'm creating a selection. The related train and fare will be selected. And here you can see that I have now an outbound space train, a total price, and the self is still on the selection. So I'm really on the selection. But I have done a one-way search. So the backend has detected that my selection is complete. So he added another link, which is create booking, because now he knows that the search is in a state where the front end can ask for a booking. That was not the case the first time we request for the selection. Here you can see that there is no. This is the selection. No, not this one. This one. You can see that there is no link to create a booking because the selection was not complete yet. Here, the selection is complete, so I can take that link. I'm doing a post once again because I'm creating a booking, and I will create a booking. So it means that I was able to lead, in fact, the front end through a workflow by serializing what are the possible next steps in the API itself. And it also means that if the front end needs to know if it can book, it doesn't have to implement any business logic. It will do such things there. It will verify that I cannot zoom. I don't remember how to zoom with VS Code. Okay. The only thing you will do is that you will verify that the links is there. That's all. That's the business logic to implement. It will disable the button if the link is not there. And we can go further because you can really do complicated stuff with that. So if now we try to go to a round-trip search, in that case, the user will specify an outbound criteria and an inbound criteria. And you will see that the backend will serialize also a link to retrieve all the possible inbounds. And now you see the difference. Join index is 1 for the inbound and join index is 0 for the outbound. So it means that the developer from the front end, he doesn't have to care about that. The mental load is on the backend. And it makes the development of the front end really simpler. And you see that, in fact, there is also another request parameter there, which is only selectable. I never had to explain you why it's there, in fact. The backend needs it. You don't have to care about that. It leads everything, you see? So to see why we have that, I'm going further in the workflow. I will select an outbound train, okay? So let's select that outbound train. So now it means that I'm inside the selection. But that time, because that's a round trip, I don't have any link to, as you can see, create a booking because the selection is not complete. I have to select an inbound train. So the backend has serialized a new link, which is inbound for current selection, because there is a complex logic for compatibility between the inbound and the outbound trains. So you don't have to implement that on the front end. There is a link for that. That's why here you have only selectable set to true. And in all inbounds, you have only selectable set to false, because all inbound will display you every inbound, regardless what you have selected. The other link will display only the compatible inbound trains. And go further, because if here you want to retrieve all the inbound, regardless what you have selected, you will see that if you want to force a selection with the select here, you have a request parameter that says that we set selection to true. It means that if you are forcing that inbound, it will reset the whole selection. So it also means that the front end doesn't have to think about that. It will be handled by the backend. And everything has been serialized in the request. In the other case, if I'm reaching that link for the compatible inbound train, you will see that the reset selection is set to false. So it means that if I select that inbound train, the selection will be complete. I have an outbound train, an inbound one, and a create booking link. And once again, I have implemented the whole workflow, and this is all led by the backend. Okay, so there is something really important. At no time, the front end must try to understand how the URL are formed. If you are doing that, you are offering a better decoupling between the consumption of your API and your implementation. You will be able to change your implementation without having any impact on the front end. It's quite sure that if you need payloads, if you change a payload, it will have an impact. You can't change that. If you are changing the payload of your response, it will have an impact as well. But for the URLs, we have a better decoupling. So to sum up, to finish, the impedance mismatch we had with REST that prevent us from building business-oriented APIs was due to the fact that we had false beliefs in REST, because some people say you can't use verbs. In fact, verbs enrich the semantic of the API. The only thing you can't do is get create, because that's confusing. The other thing is that we had a straight exposition of the implementation. We have built the API like the implementation of the problem. And because the front end was sticky to that, it was really sticky to a technical stuff and not the business intent. So instead of that, you have to make sure that your URL are built to reflect, in fact, the business intent. The other thing is that the only thing we were able to do was to serialize the fields only and not the methods. And with ATOS, you are able to attach the behaviors inside the right place in the API because you have links for select, for example. And the last thing was that we had a lack of workflow definition in the API itself. And with that play of, I'm hiding that URL, I'm serializing that URL at the right time, you are able to lead the workflow of the API from the backend itself. And with all those, we get back business intent in our APIs, and we craft business-oriented REST API. Thank you very much. If you want to take a look at the repository, you can scan that QR code. Thank you.